So I'm Hannah. I am an evaluation manager at Tazo, and I'll be kind of mostly talking to you today. And then I'll hand over to my colleague Paul.
Morning, everyone. My name's Paul Fenton Villa, and I'm the new head of evaluation at TASO. Liz?
Hello, lovely to see everybody. I'm Liz Thomas. I work at the University of York, and I'm very happy to be collaborating with the TASO team and sort of drawing on some of the research that I've done in the past and this year on a whole provider approach.
Cool, thank you both. Yeah, so we're very happy to be collaborating with Liz on this project, which is why she's joined us for the open call today as well. So this is what we're going to be running through this morning. A little welcome, which is what we're doing now. And then we'll be going through sort of the background of the project and what the project entails to give you an overview of the open call itself. I'll then go over the application form and sort of important timelines and deadlines to know. And then at the end, there'll be an opportunity to ask us any questions you may have as well. So yeah, please do enter those into the Q&A section. So just to give you a bit of background to this project on whole provider approaches, we know that obviously sort of higher education providers have been thinking kind of for a longer time about how they can link together their approaches to reducing equality gaps. So sort of thinking about the access, success, and progression work you might be doing and how you can connect that over in your sort of provider. And I suppose this process was sort of formalized a little bit more in the latest APP cycle, when the OFS asked providers to kind of include a section on their whole provider approach, at least in the later waves. And you can see a bit of guidance for this in the blue box. I appreciate it's a bit lengthy, but what the OFS has sort of emphasized in relation to the whole provider approach is ensuring that kind of departments and services across the provider are led and engaged to ensure that students are supported kind of across the student life cycle, and also to ensure that there's alignment and consistency across the organization. So I think there's a sort of emphasis on including kind of staff and departments and services from across the provider, and also students across the student life cycle. And then having that enabling environment and those sort of supportive structures and alignment within the organization to support that. And that is what kind of Liz has been working on as well. She's been sort of working with providers to develop a toolkit to support them with their whole provider approach work, which has kind of, identified these similar sort of emphases on including support across the student life cycle and operating sort of effectively across the institution as well. So while those are sort of the core components, I suppose, of the whole provider approach, we know there's a lot of variation across the sector in how providers have conceptualized and developed their approaches, and also sort of the extent to which providers might have been thinking about this or sort of able to do this as well. So in this project, we are really interested in sort of exploring this variation and better understanding those different sort of conceptualizations and implementations of whole provider approaches, including, any changes being implemented within the provider to things like leadership, structure, culture, interventions, those sort of data and evaluation and monitoring processes as well. So we really appreciate that providers are probably coming to this project with sort of quite different whole provider approaches and different extents to which you've sort of formalized that and thought about that in your APPs as well. And I think what's really important for us is to sort of understand how interventions and activities and sort of structural changes included in the whole provider approach link together to have that overarching impact rather than just being those sort of siloed activities that are disconnected across the HEPs. So that's sort of a bit of the thinking that we've been doing about whole provider approaches and how we'd better like to understand them. And how we're going to do that in practice is to develop theories of change for whole providers approaches at 6 higher education providers. And in those theories of change, we're going to include information about how you developed your whole provider approach. So we're not only interested in the sort of end product, but also how providers involved staff and students in strategic planning to sort of get to that point. what's included in the whole provider approach. So as mentioned, any sort of interventions, changes to sort of leadership, structures, processes, monitoring. Could be quite a lot of different things in here, and I imagine that providers will have different things that they focused on depending on sort of their needs. We're interested in the impact that the whole provider approach will have, obviously as a impact-led organization, for staff and for students and the provider as a whole. And then, of course, the evaluation and monitoring aspect as well. So yeah, how providers have thought about how they're going to keep track of the impact of the whole provider approach, which we appreciate can be quite challenging. But I think sort of developing this series of change and thinking about that is a really good starting block for us to then also think about evaluating whole provider approaches as well. So in terms of outputs at the end of the project, we are aiming to have 6 kind of completed theories of change that we'll then be sharing back with the sector sort of for reference, and also a summary report where we're going to sort of include some reflections on the project, how we went about developing the theories of change, and input from the providers we've worked with as well. So that is what we are hoping to get out of this project. And I just wanted to include for reference, this is Teizo's theory of change template, which is what we'll sort of be using as the basis for the theories of change in this project. There might be a bit of change depending on kind of what comes out when we're working with the providers, but just for reference, this is sort of broadly the framework that we are working with. So a little bit about working with us on the project in practice. As mentioned, we'll be working with 6 providers in total. 3 providers will be working with us at Teizo, and 3 providers will be working with Liz. So we're kind of dividing the work up like that. While we might take slightly different approaches between us, at the end, all providers will end up with a theory of change. You'll attend some kind of setup meetings with us, and we'll be running sort of one main workshop, ideally in person, at your provider to construct a theory of change, where we'll work with you to identify sort of key staff to include in that session. And then we'll have some sort of follow-up meetings and a bit more back and forth to really refine that theory of change together as well, to make sure that it accurately reflects what you're doing and you're obviously happy with it before it goes out anywhere else in the sector. And then we'll also be asking for your input for the final summary report, and potentially some other sort of comms outputs like blogs and things like that to go alongside the project. In turn, this project gives you a really good opportunity to kind of consider and refine your whole provider approach, to sort of add to the thinking you might have already been doing as part of your APP or otherwise within that like theory of change framework. You'll be able to build internal expertise generally on designing high quality theories of change by sort of having those workshops with us and Liz. And also contribute sort of to that clearer idea sector-wise of what people are doing for the whole provider approaches, how this might vary across providers, yeah, and how we can sort of better define and evaluate those approaches together. This is our project timeline, just like a broad overview. So the deadline for the open call is on the 8th of January after Christmas. We will then go through a process of selecting the providers that we want to work with, and that will be confirmed on the 22nd of January. We're then planning to run the kind of workshops and meetings to create the theories of change, so the sort of bulk of the project work in February and March next year, to have the theories of change ready at the end of March, and then the report ready at the end of April is how it's currently looking. So I think for you, the important part is to know that the open call deadline is on the 8th, and to have availability, obviously, with your teams between February and March and into April to work with us. So in terms of the application form, this is available on the webpage, and I'm sure a lot of you have already seen this. It's a Word document where the first section includes a lot of the information that I've just told you and a bit more detail as well on the project. And then at the end, we've got an application form, and it's got 3 sections. One is about the whole provider approach, one is about the relevance and impact of the project, which is the approach, and one is about the team as well. So I'll just go through these in turn broadly, but all of this information is also in the application form. So in terms of the whole provider approach, we're just sort of asking you to summarize your whole provider approach against these core points that we've identified. I appreciate there's quite a lot of text on the slide here, But essentially, we want to sort of look at the level of detail included in your approach, how the activities and initiatives you're including are kind of integrated into an overarching approach across the provider rather than sort of just being individual activities. We want to see to what extent the approach sort of spans the student life cycle, as we've talked about, engages staff and students and has that alignment and consistency within it. We're interested to see the sort of clarity of the approach and its aim, and what systems and structures are in place to ensure that it will be achieved. We want to see how much the whole provider approach kind of addresses the risks to equality of opportunity, which is obviously sort of broad overarching aim of it. And then also we'd like a bit of information on how you conceptualized and developed the whole provider approach within your teams. We've also asked for you to provide a link to your APP, and just to note, and it says this in the document as well, but please don't include links in any other section of your application. This is just so we can kind of see how you've described your approach in your APP as well, if that's something you've got. Then the second section is on the relevance and impact of the project. So then we're looking at the sort of overall quality of the whole provider approach. Its relevance to the higher education provider and to the sector as well. And then we're interested to kind of know how you think you might use that theory of change going forward as well, beyond the life cycle of the project. And then the final section is about the team, so who we'd be working with at your provider on this project. So we're interested in sort of any relevant experience in terms of being involved in the development of the whole provider approach, and also if you have any experience in sort of theory of change development as well. Anything relevant for sort of working with us on that section. Your commitment to evidence-informed practice more generally, and approach to transparency and accountability. And just some final sort of general requirements of the providers. So it's required that you are a registered provider in the approved category, that you submitted an APP last year, which includes some information about your whole provider approach, and that you are sort of willing and able to commit time and resourcing to the project in the specified timeframe of sort of February to March 2025. And just to sort of show you as well, this is the timeline specifically for the open call, which we've kind of touched on before. But yeah, just to emphasize, the call for application is obviously now open, and we're having our information webinar. The deadline is on the 8th of January. We'll then be holding most likely some follow-up calls with a kind of short list of providers. If we feel that's sort of needed, that would help us make our selections, just to ask any sort of follow-up questions in the week commencing 13th of January. We'll then be appointing HEPs on the 22nd of January and have kickoff meetings at the end of January and the week of the 27th is the plan. So that is the timeline for the open call. And I think that's everything that I have to say about the project. So we now have plenty of time for any questions that you might have, either about the project as a whole or the application process, any questions about the form. Yeah, let us know.
Brilliant, thank you, Hannah. That was really a really informative presentation. Thank you. So I think we're just waiting for questions to filter in, and if anyone is unsure where to find the Q&A panel, I think if you just hover over your screen, you should see an icon which is Q&A, and if you click on that, then a panel should appear where you can enter your questions. I think we are now seeing some questions filter in. So maybe if I start by fielding some of the questions for both yourself and maybe Liz as well. Maybe just a quick warm-up question for you both. So you mentioned, Hannah, that there'd be a theory of change workshop. I was wondering how long we might expect the theory of change workshop to take, and what to expect.
Yeah, so we're hoping to visit the providers in person that we're going to be working with, and then most likely the workshop will be sort of half a day or less, maybe like 2 or 3 hours. We're conscious of your time as well. And in those workshops, yeah, we'll sort of be working our way through those sort of theory of change sections, and sort of building up the theory of change as a resource. So there probably won't be much new information you have to gather for that. We would imagine that a lot of this stuff you already know, or it's in your whole provider approach if you've got that documented. But the workshop will just kind of help us and you to sort of get that information down on paper in a structured way. And yeah, we'll be thinking of ways to make that kind of as interactive as possible, and you know, sort of interesting for you as well, and an opportunity for you to think through those different elements. So yeah, we'd imagine sort of a few hours in person at your university campus.
Thanks. And just, I guess, just a quick question that's also come in. So, do you have an idea of how much senior time or senior leader time might need to be committed? So, one individual has mentioned that there's a project manager that can commit time, but it'd be useful to know time constraints for more senior colleagues.
Yeah, good question. I think it's a bit of a cop-out answer, but it depends a little bit on their involvement in the development of your whole provider approach. So obviously in the workshops, it's important that we can work with people that like have a good understanding of the approach and that sort of worked on the development to an extent. So if you feel like there's sort of people in your team, like your project manager, that could sort of cover that information, then that's completely fine. But yeah, I imagine it just depends a little bit on how that process was within your institution and how that sort of understanding and involvement in the whole provider approach looks. Liz, yeah, do you want to come in as well?
Yeah, I was just thinking it's a great question. And when we were chatting earlier, Paul was suggesting that we might also build in some short one-to-one meetings. So if you think there are colleagues that might be important but couldn't give up that amount of time, I would have thought ideally having a one-to-one meeting on that day or a small group meeting or having an online meeting might plug that gap and allow them to have some input without feeling they have to commit such a large amount of time if it's not appropriate for them.
Yeah, thanks, Liz. So the next question, I think this is also something that we've briefly touched upon in our previous conversations as well, which is asking about the types of providers that can apply. So just to check whether Wave 3 providers are able to apply, as well as providers that may have been in Wave 1 of submitting their APPs and etc.
Liz, do you want to take this one? Because we were talking about this before a bit.
Well, my view is that all providers should be eligible to apply. And I understand the question about Wave 3 because you haven't actually submitted your APPs. You mean the ones that are going to be due in? I think Sam's referring to some of the small providers who have not got a deadline yet for APPs to be submitted in 2025. But I think it would be really helpful to have them involved as well. And I do also think that Wave 1 providers would be eligible as well. But I think if you've got a different view, Hannah.
No, that's fine.
We haven't figured everything out at this point. Someone mentions the tight timelines, and that's true for us as well.
Yes, yeah, I think, yeah, I appreciate the application is quite explicit about having submitted an APP. I think from our end, the advantage of that is if we can work with providers who've already done some thinking, it's likely to sort of facilitate that theory of change process, and make that a little bit easier if you've obviously already had some internal sort of conversations and formalized your approach a little bit. However, we're not opposed to working with providers for whom that kind of hasn't been the case so much yet. It depends a little bit on how many applications we get as well. I appreciate it's all a bit vague and I do apologize for that. But yeah, I think if this is something you're sort of interested in developing further within your institution, and you're kind of able to sort of put in the time you think internally and sort of gather that information, then even if you've not included that in your APP, then we would still encourage you to apply, and there's sort of space in the application form for that as well. I think if we get a lot of promising applications, then it would be really interesting for us as well to work with providers who are at different stages of that sort of journey. But yeah, it's a bit of an unknown for us as well, this project. We've not done much work on whole provider approaches before. It's obviously a little bit of a new concept within the sort of APP context. So to an extent for us, we're also just sort of seeing what we get from the HAPs and then going from there. So yeah, I appreciate that maybe that isn't quite so clear in the application form. But yeah, as I said, if you're willing to sort of and able to kind of put in the time and have that information, then yeah, still very happy to hear from you.
Yeah. So just to summarize, so we're definitely open to a range of providers at different stages of development of their whole provider approach. And I think that's certainly something that we'd consider as well in our selection process, if we can identify providers with a range of different stages along the development of their approach. We're certainly interested in working with all of those different types of providers. So the next question is there an expectation for the approaches to include interventions or activities aiming to get type 3 evidence?
It's not a requirement. I understand where that question will come from with our focus. But yeah, no, that is not a requirement. We're obviously interested to see your sort of evaluation planning around those interventions as well, but no, it doesn't have to be type 3.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think we're more focused on the theory element in this project, not necessarily directly indicating the precise type of evaluation that you might use to evaluate that the various activities that you might include in your whole provider approach, and so we're certainly not stipulating that that the activities should be amenable to a type 3 evidence evaluation. So for the next question, so this is a very good question. So how much theory of change knowledge would the team working on this need to have?
I mean, similar answer to before, I guess, where if the team has sort of more experience already in developing theories of change, that might make the process of running those workshops easier. I think within the sort of capacity and time we have within the project, we're not expecting to be able to give a kind of full background introduction to theory of change to the providers we are working with. But in the workshops, we will be sort of facilitating the construction of a theory of change, together, with a bit of space for sort of explanation. So if there is some experience, that's helpful. It doesn't have to be super extensive. It's hard to put an exact definition on it, but sort of, yeah, if you've had some engagement with theory of change, perhaps sort of tried constructing some for your interventions, or at least you've looked at some theories of changes before and feel that you have a kind of good understanding of them, then yeah, that would be sufficient. We're not expecting people to be experts in theories of change, like that's what we're there for. But it does help if you've got a bit of an understanding of, the structure and the aim of a theory of change.
So I guess in applications, it's useful if individuals indicate where they may already have experience with theories of change. However, that's not a prerequisite, and just reflecting on how many of these theories of change workshops actually run, we tend to run them with questions, don't we? So even if you don't necessarily know the nuts and bolts of a theory of change, usually most participants can answer the questions that would then inform the theory of change development. So that would also help to alleviate some of those issues if you're not quite the expert in theory of change, for example. Liz, is there anything you might add to that?
No, I don't think it's realistic necessarily that everybody could be an expert in theory of change, and that many of the people who might be involved in the wider whole provider approach would add good knowledge more generally. And I think that's the point of having Tezo and me involved rather than just doing it perhaps internally.
Yeah, brilliant. So the next question is, there seems to be a requirement for existing experience and existing development of a whole provider approach. Is this open call directed at those HEPs who are further ahead, or would you encourage, so I think this is what something that we've just mentioned before, that we'd actually encourage HEPs from at all stages of development of their whole provider approach. I'm now getting towards the end of the list, which are the ones that I haven't quite managed to read yet. So as I continue to filter these, So you mentioned staff, but what about working with students? Would we be able to hold our own workshops internally in preparation to allow for more ground up approach to the final theory of change?
Yeah, absolutely. We'd welcome anyone doing any sort of internal work in preparation for this project if you feel like that would be helpful. Yeah, that's absolutely fine. We've envisaged in those workshops that we'd mostly be working with staff. However, like we're very happy to sort of collaboratively think about what that with the provider, who you think would be helpful to include. Again, just sort of based on what your whole provider approach includes, and how you're sort of thinking about it and approaching it within your institutions. But yeah, if you yourself want to sort of hold any workshops like that or involve students or staff from sort of other teams that might not be able to be there in the final workshop, then yeah, we'd absolutely welcome that. That sounds like a great idea.
Yeah. Sorry, Liz, was there anything that you
I
wanted
just
to?
want to really support that. I think student involvement is great. I don't think we're requiring it, and in previous work I've kind of required it, but I think if it definitely would be a strength rather than a problem.
Yeah. And I'd assume that potentially we may be able to also include some, have some student representation within the theory of change workshops directly themselves as well. That would be another option that we can think through with providers if that'd be appropriate, and how best to do that as well. So quite happy to think flexibly about how we might approach the issue of student engagement in the different theories of change projects. So the next question is, please could you share any more on how you select applications and if you'll be looking for a range of types of providers, so providers of different types, different sizes potentially.
Yeah, so I'm just scrolling through as well. I think there's a couple of questions kind of along these lines of the selection process. So yeah, obviously the core things are sort of in the application form, those points that I mentioned. I think in practice, yeah, we'd love to work with a range of providers, if we get appropriate kind of applications from a range. So both different sizes of providers. Someone had also asked a question about kind of geography or regions. So yeah, we'd love to work with providers from a spread of across England as well, in different regions. There's no sort of specific selection criteria for that. That's just something that we'll be sort of taking into consideration. Again, depending on the number and the quality of the applications, we would ideally really like to work with a range of providers so that we can see kind of how whole provider approaches might be influenced by those factors, and to make sure that in our outputs of our 6 theories of change, we've got a bit of a representative spread.
Brilliant. Liz, anything that you'd like to add?
No, I just to support all that really. I raised this originally, and we saw those as secondary things. So we will take that into account after we've got like a long list.
Yeah. Brilliant. So the next question is: if we're already working with TASO or involved in another project, will this affect our chances of being selected for this opportunity?
Yeah, no, the short answer is no, I believe. Yeah, no, I mean, our projects run sort of separately from each other. So as long as you have the internal capacity to engage and meet with those projects, no, that will have no bearing on this project.
Sorry, my panel is jumping around. So I'd like to, one of the attendees is asking, I would like to ask whether there are any other selection criteria such as regional selection, which I think we've just mentioned, if we need to make changes to our APP, can we do this through the to the whole provider approach process, or do we need to submit a separate variation document to the OFS?
So you'd have to submit separately to the OFS. So yeah, this project is just a TASO project in collaboration with Liz. Yeah, this doesn't sort of relate to your APPs as documents that you submit to the OFS. It's just sort of informed by that whole provider approach thinking you might have been doing within your APP. But yeah, if there's any formal changes you want to make as a result, then that is a separate thing.
Samantha has noted that your slide stated that providers needed to have submitted their APP in 2024. I think we can clarify that that's that's potentially we can clarify that actually providers, as we mentioned before, of at all different stages of development of their whole provider approach
Yes.
are
Sorry.
eligible, and so you would not have had to have submitted the APP in 2024 to be eligible for this opportunity.
There's quite a lot of comments about that. So there are the people who've submitted in 2023 who we've said are in. Then there are people who've submitted in 2024, but whose APPs have not been published yet or not been approved or whatever. So there's a question then about whether you can submit an attached APP if it's not been, because it might not be in the public domain yet.
Yeah, that's fine. Shall I just briefly comment on that? Sorry. Yes, appreciate that will be the case for some people, and apologies that we haven't sort of made this very clear in the application form. I think we might try and clarify that after the session as well. Just in the form.
Then there are those who haven't submitted yet. So there are some who haven't got approval yet and some who haven't submitted yet.
Yeah, that's all right. I think if you note in that section of your application form, if that's the case for you, because we've asked for a link to the APP, and if you are then able to attach separate documentation of your unsubmitted APP or your not yet approved APP, then that will be fine. Yeah.
So very much eligibility status is independent of a provider's APP. I think that's what we're trying to say, and that obviously that these projects are not related to the APP process run by the OFS. It's very much an independent project, but hopefully informative in the long run for that process as well for each provider. So there's a question here for Liz. So in the application form, the application form states that TASO and Liz will take the lead on most aspects of the project. In practice, how much involvement do you anticipate will be required from providers in addition to information provision and having those meetings and workshops?
So I think in addition to those two things, so there'll be a bit of kind of setup admin. I imagine you'd have a sort of project lead that we talk to about arranging things. Yeah, having the meetings and workshops, and then the involvement after that will be within the sort of reviewing and refining process. So what I imagine would happen is we kind of go away after the meetings and workshops, develop a draft of the theory of change, then perhaps have a sort of follow-up feedback meeting with the provider just to sort of refine that. And then, yeah, so I'd anticipate that maybe being one or two more meetings, some email back and forth. And then drafting the report will be primarily done by ourselves at TASO with some input from Liz. And we'll be asking the providers for sort of specific input and reflections, I would imagine, rather than asking you to sort of draft a whole report. So yeah, I'd anticipate a bit of writing time within that's mostly just going to be reflecting on sort of how the process was for you and sort of your reflections on your whole provider approach. So again, not any massive sort of new content. And then yeah, potentially just a bit of reviewing as well, back and forth on that content as well. I hope that is sort of enough information on that. So yeah, I think the bulk of your involvement will be the sort of theory of change workshop and any additional meetings we might want to do with individuals. And then yeah, primarily sort of reviewing sort of via email or potentially some follow-up meetings as well. Yeah.
And so just I guess just to confirm, so roughly how many people would you be looking to have part of the project team? I think this varies, doesn't it? The answer can be quite variable depending on. I guess what's more key is the experience and knowledge of the individuals in each instance. There's probably not a set number or quota. It's just more the knowledge of the individuals to participate and provide information about the whole provider approach. I don't know if Liz, if you might expand on that.
I think probably given that we've got representatives of very small organizations and institutions along with large institutions, that's probably not useful to say there must be this many. And also my sense is that some institutions might focus on a particular aspect of their whole provider approach, which would steer them towards involving certain colleagues or people from across the institutional student body. So I think it's a workshop that we're encouraging you to kind of convene. So that's a kind of part of the early scoping conversations that we'd have with each institution, I think. But we certainly wouldn't sort of, be locking the doors and suggesting people can't participate.
Yeah. And so just a couple more questions that I can see in the Q&A panel, and then I'll check the chat very quickly, see if any more have come in via the chat. So a very good question, and Liz, I don't know whether you might want to try and answer this question. So for colleagues not yet expert with using a theory of change approach, can you explain what the benefits are and what are the drawbacks of not having a theory of change would be?
Yeah, I mean, I can touch on this as well. So theory of change is I mean, I don't want to get into a whole theory of change webinar here, but it's just a really useful sort of framework to have for you to kind of summarize in one place the sort of aims, activities, and impacts of any sort of activity or project that you are doing. In this case, obviously the whole provider approach. So if that's something that within your organization you've not been able to do much yet, this project will be quite a useful way, I think, to get a bit of a crash course in sort of theory of change and constructing that in practice as well. So not just the sort of template, but yeah, how in practice you'll be able to see in a workshop how we kind of go about putting that together. More broadly beyond this project, a theory of change, sort of at TASO, we always say, and also I do think is a really useful jumping off point for planning any further evaluation. So we always encourage providers to start with a theory of change if they're looking at evaluation later on. So this is something that, yeah, it doesn't just help you to sort of capture what you're doing in one place and to ensure there's sort of agreement and alignment across your team on what you're doing, but also has benefits sort of further down the line. If you're thinking about evaluating your projects, if you're thinking about communicating things externally and internally, theory of change is a really useful tool for that. Yeah, Liz, I don't know if any more thoughts on the
Sorry,
benefits.
apologies. I was reading the other
That's fine.
questions in the chat. I didn't catch that. Are you asking me? No,
No,
I
don't worry.
think I broadly agree with that, Hannah, of course. And I suppose what I think is really useful about a theory of change is to test the logic of your intervention or
Yes.
your approach. And quite often we know what we want to do, but we're not always thinking through how it will contribute to our bigger goals. And I think that is the kind of challenging part of this work, that we think a whole provider approach is a really valuable way to go, but actually testing the logic of how making some of these changes will ultimately improve. Well, I think the goal of whole provider approach is to improve student equity or promote student equity. So I think there's really interesting questions that a theory of change helps you to tease out, to test that logic. And then, of course, it does have all the other advantages around planning, evaluation, and knowing what everyone's doing, and sort of highlighting the different views about what's involved in an intervention or an activity, which sometimes get hidden if you don't have a more explicit model like this.
And I guess a related question. So will the theory of change be broken down by the student life cycle, such as access, success, and progression?
It remains to be seen, I think. So we're not coming in with a sort of, we have that template in mind, obviously, but we're not necessarily coming in with a specific structure for how the theory of change will be broken down in mind. This is likely to vary by provider as well. As Liz mentioned, like some providers might just be focusing on one more specific aspect across their whole provider approach, like their enabling environment or their student engagement or something like that. So yeah, we'd imagine that will just depend a little bit on what comes out of the workshops, and part of the workshops is for us to figure out together like how we can break down the theory of change. Yeah, Liz, I don't know if you have any thoughts.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I've done quite a bit of thinking about this, and I think it is sometimes quite hard to figure out how it all connects together, and what the logic of the theory of change is. But I think some changes would definitely be contributing to particular parts of the life cycle, and some will be contributing to all. And so I think it will depend, as Hannah says, on whether we're looking at what you're trying to do and what's appropriate for your institutional context, because of course some institutions are focusing more heavily on some parts of the life cycle anyway. So yeah, I can imagine it doing both, basically, some focusing on particular parts of the life cycle and some looking at all of them.
Yeah. And so I'm now just appreciating time because I think we are coming up to, am I right in saying this? We're coming up to towards the end of the session. So I think before we take the last couple of questions, this is obviously just to say that I think what we'll try to do is collate the questions that we've received today and maybe share a follow-up FAQ, just maybe summarizing some of our answers to provide clarity, because obviously we've received quite a lot of questions today, and I think that it's been really helpful for us, and hopefully it's been really helpful for many of our colleagues that are interested in this project. So I think potentially what we'll try to do is summarize some of our responses, just so you have that clarity that you can take away with you, and we'll email that to the participants list today. So the last couple of questions that we'll cover. So one colleague has asked, do you think that one member of staff could take this on their own, or would you say that it's completely unfeasible?
It depends how effective that member of staff is, I guess. I mean, I think, like we've said, we'd imagine that you'll have a sort of project team working with us, but then you'll be convening people for those sort of workshops and meetings. So in that sense, yeah, that might well be doable for you if one member of staff would be able to sort of do the necessary internal convening to bring people in for kind of the necessary time points where we might need their input, but not have more than one person working on the project overall. Yeah, I guess again, then the rest of the input, as mentioned, would be in the sort of reviewing the theories of change together and the report and things like that. So I think if you feel comfortable within your institution that would be doable for you, then yeah, we're not putting any restrictions on that. So yeah, I don't think it's unfeasible. It might just be a bit more work for that one person.
Yeah, I think it's definitely helpful. It's often quite helpful to have a focal lead with an institution that can also kind of act as a focal point that we communicate with and we engage with regularly, and that obviously also kind of monitors the project from a provider's perspective. But obviously, almost by definition, because we're doing workshops, we would expect kind of broader inputs from others within the provider. But obviously, what we've said is that we're not necessarily naming the number of individuals that would be appropriate. I think that would depend on the context and the specific project itself. So for some very small providers, actually the most relevant staff may be a very small number of people. Other providers, there may be more individuals that would be relevant to feed into those discussions. And so we'd have to take that decision on a case-by-case basis and kind of consult with each provider as to what would be an appropriate level of input from within their institution. So the final question that we'll cover today is related to funding. So whether there's any funding associated with taking part in the project.
And the short answer is no. Yeah, this is not a funded project like some of our bigger evaluation projects are. This is more sort of, I suppose, a collaborative, exploring together sort of project, yeah, where we'd be partnering with the institutions, but no, there's no funding involved.
There were a couple of comments about struggling to access the form, and some people saying they've sorted it out. So can I just ask that we double check that there are no glitches in the application form? But it does look like it may not be a problem anyway. So
Okay.
we'll have a little look at that one. And also
Interesting.
request to share the recording of the session, which you've already agreed to do. So yeah.
Yes, yeah, the recording will be shared with everyone who signed up, and I think it will also be available through our website.
Perfect.
Great. I think that brings us to the end. Thank you all so much for attending and for all of your questions. Yeah, we're really looking forward to sort of getting started on this project and hopefully working with some of you. So yeah, we'd definitely encourage people to sort of put in an application if that is possible. I saw one person sort of noting the tight timelines, and yeah, I just want to acknowledge that we're aware it is a little bit tight. I think the hope for us would be that people, sort of institutions, will have already been thinking about the whole provider approaches a little bit. So the application form, in that sense, wouldn't require so much new information to be collated. But yeah, we are sort of conscious of that, and when reviewing the applications, we'll be bearing that in mind. So yes, I just wanted to acknowledge that before we finish for the day. But yeah, thank you all so much for coming. If you have any further questions, please do drop us an email on research@taso.org.uk. We'll be monitoring that and very happy to get back to you as well. And then, yeah, just to briefly say again, we'll be kind of sending out a little feedback form after this session. So please keep an eye out for that if you're able to share some feedback with us. But yeah, thank you so much to Liz and Paul as well for supporting with the session. And we look forward to hearing from you all soon. And have a lovely Christmas break if you are going on that soon.
Thank you. Thank you for coming, and look forward to working with you in the new year.
Thanks everyone. Thanks Anna. Thanks Liz. Thanks. Bye bye.